Okay, let's begin while everyone continues to trickle in. So welcome everyone to the next series of the Gap for EPR informal sector webinar series. To give you a quick introduction to Gap for EPR, Gap for EPR is the Global Action Partnership for Extended Producer Responsibility. And this is an international partnership established between GIZ, OECD, UNEP, EMF, and WWF. And it's hosted by the Prevent Waste Alliance, an international think and do tank that connects circular economy practitioners worldwide. And today we have the next session on this series, Cooperation with the Informal Sector, Key Pillars to Successful EPR Implementation with the Fair Circularity Initiative Secretariat. And before we begin, I just want to give a quick disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed in this webinar do not necessarily reflect the positions of the core partners of Gap for EPR, nor the Prevent Waste Alliance members or official policy positions of the international organizations and governments involved. But yeah, without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers for today. Today we have Charlene Collison, who is the Director of Collaborations and Partnerships for the Fair Circularity Initiative. Charlene specializes in building collaborative approaches between consumer-facing companies and their value chains to embed long-term sustainability, build resilience in the face of disruption, and increase equity, inclusion, and justice. And then we also have Rich Gower here, who is the specialist advisor for the Fair Circularity Initiative. Rich has spent the last 10 years working at the interface between plastics and human rights. He's played a leading role in convening the Fair Circularity Initiative while co-leading Tearfund's advocacy program on plastic pollution and has been deeply involved in the negotiations for the UN Plastics Treaty. So without further ado, I will hand over to Charlene and Rich for their presentation today on the waste picker integration into EPR. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And I'm going to start by bringing up a slide deck, which I hope you can all see now. And I'm going to set the scene for today's topic, waste picker integration into EPR, and then I'll be followed up by Rich. So a quick introduction to the FCI. We're a coalition of corporate members. You can see the names on the slide, and also some NGO members, including the International Alliance of Waste Pickers, who sits on our steering committee and act as advisors for everything that we do. And we work to advance adoption of the fair circularity principles within national governments and also within corporate practice. And you'll be hearing today from me, representing the Fair Circularity Initiative. BSR is the Secretariat for that. You'll then hear from Rich, and then we've asked Delia from the Consumer Goods Forum to say a few words at the end. So over the next just under 20 minutes, I'll give a quick bit of context on the issues facing waste pickers and the need for integrated EPR legislation. Rich is going to share some lessons from good practice that we've gathered from different countries where EPR has been introduced or is being introduced, and then share some lessons about what that means for design and infrastructure of EPR. So firstly, a quick bit of context. So firstly, waste pickers account for 60% of global plastic that's collected for recycling, which is an enormous contribution to recycling value chains. But they generally are not appreciated and are underpaid, suffering quite difficult living and working conditions, as we'll see in just a moment. Here is a definition of waste pickers, which is really quite important, as we'll see as we hear from some of the following speakers, to define waste pickers in the definition that has been provided by the International Alliance of Waste Pickers. They're own account workers in informal, semi-formal, or cooperative settings. So there's quite a range of settings they might work in, involving the collection, sorting, transporting, and commercialization of discarded materials for recycling or reuse. So bear that definition in mind as we look at some of the issues that are facing them. This slide sets out a number of factors that businesses are increasingly taking into account when they develop their strategy and in the way that they are working to transform their supply chains to respect the human rights of waste pickers. So I'll call out just a few of the most critical ones. Particularly with evolving EPR, and as companies scale up the use of recycled content, more and more human rights and livelihoods of waste pickers are upstream responsibilities that they need and do take into account. This is really also exacerbated by attention on plastic pollution. So there's more and more scrutiny from a range of stakeholders about the conditions impacting waste pickers. Many brands, particularly our members, have human rights policies that commit them to respecting and advancing the human rights of waste pickers. And also, not having those policies in place is increasingly presenting significant risk. So there's both the carrot and the stick for companies to pay attention and adopt practices that include the Fair Circularity Principles, which are a set of principles developed through the FCI that advance the human rights of waste pickers across a range of practice areas. So I just want to call attention to this slide here, which came out of research that we carried out on waste pickers' ability to earn a living income and the key challenges that face them in doing that. So there are a number of categories that you can see here that make it really difficult for waste pickers. And what we're going to focus on here is the one in the center bottom, the lack of institutional support. They are often not included in the national law that gives them rights and coverage as workers. They often, when they do have any rights, they may not be aware of the rights that they have or how to claim them or ensure access. And they have very limited social programs, which means that waste pickers are often marginalized. And there are means that can be taken to address those, such as the creation of credit schemes, which has recently been adopted in places like India and Brazil. But in most places, there is simply a lack of institutional support, which EPR can regulate. And we're going to be focusing on that increasingly in the next few minutes. And then finally, I'm going to just quickly share some insights that have come from this research into living wage, which demonstrate that waste pickers generally have a median earning of about 35% of the living income. This is in a range of over 20 different locations around the world that we studied. So yeah, that is a very low income across the board for waste pickers. And you can see the different regions that we carried out research on the left-hand side of the screen. We looked at the different locations, so you can see they vary quite significantly across the different locations, and that depends partly on whether they are informally organized or simply independent. But you can see again, waste pickers generally earning far below the living income, and then in almost all cases far below the minimum wage, which is the orange dot that you see. And then finally, there is a slightly better case for waste pickers that are formally organized, so that as the level of organization increases, as they put themselves or organize themselves into cooperatives, their income tends to increase. But across the board, there is a very large gap to close to reduce the the gap between what waste pickers earn and what they need to live on. And so the recommendations from this study and other work across the FCI is summarized here on this slide. And the key among them is to strengthen EPR frameworks to be inclusive of informal waste pickers. There are other points that you can see here, but we're going to focus today on the strengthening of EPR frameworks. And I'm going to hand over to Rich to do that.
Thanks very much, Charlene. So Charlene has set out the business case for waste picker integration from a human rights perspective. And I want to start by touching on the business case for integration from an efficiency perspective. So from the perspective of setting up cost-effective EPR schemes. And in order to do this, let's revisit those statistics that Charlene shared earlier. If we go to the next slide, please. So globally, around 60% of all the plastic collected for recycling is collected by waste pickers. Now that's an average, so in many countries it's significantly higher than that, particularly in the global south. So in one context where we've been working recently in Indonesia, it's virtually all plastic collected for recycling that comes through waste pickers. And in contexts like that, if we want to set up cost-effective EPR, we have to be mindful of the current reality of informal value chains. We're not setting up a new collection system in a vacuum. There's already an informal ecosystem that exists, and we need to take account of that when we create EPR. And if we don't do that, we can create a real headache for ourselves down the line. So just two examples of this. If we go to the next slide. In 2002 in Egypt, in Cairo, the long-standing informal door-to-door waste collection service was replaced by contracts with European waste management companies, and that caused a real headache. So the system was more expensive, it was also much worse, and those who had provided the system initially, the Zabaleen, lost their incomes. And in the end, the companies tried to hire back the Zabaleen to do the work that they had been doing in the first place. So things went badly wrong. A specific example on EPR, we've got an example from India. So in 2016, India's EPR system for e-waste was set up without adequately accounting for the informal value chains that already existed. And what it did, in effect, was to create a parallel system that competed with well-established informal markets. As a result, 10 years later, the informal sector still collects the vast majority of e-waste there, despite all of the money that's been spent on the formal EPR system. Now, the government in India and others have recognised the issue and the need for future integration. And in fact, the Indian government is doing some really interesting and exciting things on waste picker integration at the moment. Their Namaste scheme for waste pickers, which started last year, has registered about 150,000 waste pickers so far. And that's focusing on things like improved access to finance, safer working conditions, and linking them with social security and welfare schemes. So that's an exciting example. But the main point I'm making here is that if we want EPR to be cost effective, we have to recognise and integrate informal value chains. Otherwise, we can cause significant problems down the line. So how do we do that? Well, there are 3 steps. If we go to the next slide, the first I've just talked about, so recognising the reality of informal value chains and reflecting that in legislation. The second is to develop a contextually appropriate approach to integration. So rather than trying to transplant a model from Brazil or South Africa into another context, we instead need to look at the particular context, map the value chains there, speak to all the relevant stakeholders, gather all the available evidence, and come up with a contextually appropriate approach. And then thirdly, we have to take care to operationalise that via appropriate governance, registration systems, contracting payment systems, and so on. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. The first of these, so recognising the reality of informal value chains, I thought it might be really interesting, this on the next slide, just to see some of the entries on the rapidly growing list of countries where waste pickers are formally recognised in legislation. So the Mexican circular economy law was passed just in January of this year. That focuses on inclusive recycling as one of the elements there. Inclusive recycling is about the social, economic and environmental contribution of waste pickers and developing models that include them in the circular economy. We've got South Africa's EPR regulations from 2021, and that stipulates that PROs there have to integrate informal waste collectors into the post-consumer collection value chain. If we go to the next slide, we've also got Brazil, where they've had a long-standing recognition of waste pickers in their solid waste national policy. We've also got Ghana's draft EPR regulations, which were released a few months ago, and they have multiple provisions related to waste picker registration, organisation and payment, including an obligation on PROs to include them in the reverse value chain. And of course, we've also got the Plastics Treaty process and the mandate for that agreed at UNEA 5.2, which recognised the vital contribution of waste pickers and requires the Plastics Treaty to take due account of that. And this list is growing all the time. So there is a lot of momentum behind recognising the role of waste pickers in legislation. Step 2 then, how do we do that? How do we develop a contextually appropriate approach? Well, through a collaborative process is the answer, and there's a good example of this from South Africa. So on the right-hand side, we've got South Africa's Waste Picker Integration Guideline. That was mandated by their National Waste Management Strategy, and it involved a participatory process with academics, waste pickers, business, national government, local government. That's the sort of process that sets the standard for developing a contextually appropriate approach. Now, 3 areas to consider as part of this process, if we go to the next slide. And this is something we've worked really closely with the Consumer Goods Forum on. So on the next slide, you'll see a screenshot of a paper we produced with CGF last year. There's a chapter in that paper on waste picker integration into EPR that the FCI co-wrote. So the first area to consider is contracting. Now, sometimes when EPR is set up, it makes it very expensive or difficult for existing waste picker groups to keep functioning and collecting and processing waste. It might be that they have to undergo a lengthy registration process or pay a high fee to register. And that's a barrier to them continuing the work they're already doing. I know, for example, in Kenya, that's a problem at the moment under their new EPR law. So instead, what we need to think about is setting up a simplified approach to contracting with waste picker groups so they can continue the work they're already doing. Brazil has a really good example of this. Their solid waste national policy mandates the prioritisation of waste picker cooperatives, and they have a simplified contracting process for them. So that's the first area to consider. The second I'd like to talk about is governance. It's by including waste pickers in the governance around EPR that we can understand some of these potential pitfalls, like the one on contracting I've just talked about. And this is also about, of course, giving waste pickers a say in the decisions that affect their lives. There's another good example from Brazil. So since 2003, they've had an interministerial committee on waste picker integration, and their waste and citizenship forums there are another example. And then we'll move on to the third example, which is waste picker payment. So this is about payment of individual waste pickers, so waste pickers who aren't working in cooperatives. One slide back, please, Charlene. So individual waste pickers operating on their own. South Africa is a good example here. They have a collection service fee established in their EPR regulations. And this means that they receive a top-up payment in addition to the material price for the recyclates that they've collected. And that's implemented through a 3-pronged approach. Waste pickers register on the South Africa Waste Picker Registration System. That gives them an occupational identity card. They're also registered on a digital payment system, and that gives them a digital payment card. And then approved weight tracking and payment systems are being rolled out to buyback centres and eventually to informal buyers in South Africa. And that means that when a registered waste picker sells to a buyback centre using one of those weight tracking and payment systems, they receive the price for their materials, the ones they're selling, and they receive a top-up collection service fee on that digital payment card. And that system's being rolled out at the moment. The FCI is involved in some of those conversations in South Africa. Let's move on to step 3, operationalising. So once we've developed the ideas for a contextually appropriate approach, we have to operationalise it. Now, very briefly, some things that will help here. So establish a waste picker integration task force that brings together all the relevant federal government ministries, local government, PROs and waste pickers themselves. Each of those organisations should have a waste picker integration plan, so it's clear who's responsible for what. We also need to recognise this is quite a new area of policy, so we need to build in mechanisms for learning and reflecting as we go. The sort of things that can help with that are ensuring transparent reporting. So I mentioned earlier, in India, the government's just reported a couple of weeks ago on the number of waste pickers registered so far under their Namaste scheme. Building capacity as well. This is a new area. It might be that local government or staff in PROs need to understand more about how waste pickers operate. The African Reclaimers Organisation in South Africa runs a day in the life of a reclaimer event that staff can attend to get a perspective on how they work. On the other side, waste picker cooperatives may need their capacity strengthened for contracting and invoicing and that sort of thing. So we have to make provision for that. And then the last 2 points really, it's about collaborative working and learning from elsewhere. And Delia is going to talk a bit more about this. Waste picker integration isn't something that one PRO can deliver on their own. It requires all of the stakeholders to work together. And that requires good systems for collaborative working and the ability to learn from good practice overseas. Now, as I said, we've worked really closely with CGF on this topic, and the paper that I mentioned earlier has a chapter on waste picker integration and 2 others on infrastructure and institutions. So we wanted to give the last bit of our time to Delia from CGF to talk about those 2 areas.
Thank you so much, Rich, for laying out all of those steps in the legislative framework. So from an industry's perspective, obviously a law can only be effective as the actual institution who is executing it. And that's why we need a robust governance structure in place. We looked closely over the past years at institutional design and at what a good producer responsibility organization looks like. And while we generally prefer a centralized single pro model, because we think it definitely helps in terms of efficiency, but also level playing field, we do recognize that different markets may choose another path, which is a multiple pro model. The core message here is that regardless of the model in place, there are some functions that really need to be fulfilled by the PRO. And the legislation must also mandate that this institutions actually fulfill all of the core functions. While I'm not going to focus on all of them, you can see that the informal sector integration, as mentioned by Rich previously, it's not just a nice to have or a voluntary add-on. It's actually a key operational requirement for the EPR system to actually work. And this is truly important, especially in those countries where waste pickers, again, are the backbone of sorting and collection. If we go to the next slide in terms of infrastructure, once we have that accountable institution fulfilling all of those core functions, we need to tackle another challenge, which is obviously infrastructure. And again, an EPR fee cannot only suffice to actually bridge the gap on investment. And beyond institutions, we definitely need to be a bit careful about how those EPR funds are actually used and deployed. Rich was sharing some examples where this was done poorly in other countries, obviously, where actually failing to engage the informal sector and look first at the local gaps created some kind of parallel system that competed actually with the established informal markets. This is something that really needs to be avoided. And again, most importantly, these EPR funds, they need to be able to catalyze the investment further and actually fill in those existing infrastructure gaps, making sure that any investment actually also empowers waste pickers rather than displacing them or taking away income from them. That's why, for instance, in this case, having some kind of long-term contracts would definitely help. Both in terms of revenue for collectors, but also in terms of ensuring there's actually a stable feedstock supply for recyclers. So there's some kind of financial certainty that develops and grows the system. As Rich was, talking about the South African model, infrastructure is not just about physical, it's also about the digital and the financial aspect. That's why the PRO needs to consider investing in fair compensation, setting up those digital registries, having some kind of tracking system for materials, but also grievance mechanism to ensure that all of the fees actually flow transparently and that they reach the waste pickers themselves. Obviously, there's, I guess, one big key message that we wanted attendees to take away from today. It is definitely like that the business community is strongly in favor of integrating waste speakers into EPR. It is not only essential for respecting human rights, but also essential in building the EPR system in these countries. We're definitely keen to hear some of your questions. We know that we went through a lot of interesting content and steps and examples for today. So we wanted to make sure that there's some time for interaction as well. And Rich and Charlene, if there's anything that you wanted to add to the conclusion, please don't hesitate to jump in as well.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you. No,
Rich.
nothing further.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlene, Rich, and Delia for your presentation and for really highlighting the importance of informal sector integration into EPR systems. And also the fact that collaboration is key. And it's great to hear that businesses are in favor of integrating the informal sector and would like to work towards that. Yeah. So the floor is to everyone participating. If you guys have any questions, please put them in the chat or feel free to raise your hand. We have the first question in the chat right now from Francis West. What more would you want to see from companies to realize the objectives that you are setting out for EPR? Delia, you want to take over? Oh, yeah.
I mean, I have to say that in the Plastic Waste Coalition of Action, we have pretty engaged members. Obviously, they have contributed to these papers. I would say that policymakers definitely play a key role when shaping up this legislation. So in terms of advocacy, already putting these messages on the table and making sure that they reach the right people, because again, if legislation is set up early from the beginning, then it's going to be very hard to actually pick up on those mistakes. And Rich was speaking about some of those examples where that happened. So if there's opportunity for companies to share these messages further and re-emphasize the importance of integration, I think that's definitely one place to start.
Thank you. And I'd just like to follow on by saying that the companies that are members of the Fair Circularity Initiative have all made a commitment to work towards the implementation of the principles, and our collective work is to advocate for the uptake of the principles, both to governments and within other companies. And we welcome other members to join us in this work. It's really important work and growing work. There is a great deal of work to be done. Rich, I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah, just to reinforce those things, I think it's partly about leverage, isn't it? And companies using their leverage, as Delia said. So I think there's a temptation in some countries to look at the European model of EPR, for example, and try and transplant that. And there's obviously a lot of expertise around the European model, but that isn't appropriate in many countries in the global south. And I think it takes quite a strong voice from business and others to say, you've got to focus on waste picker integration in order for people to kind of realize they can't just take a model from Europe or elsewhere and transplant it. So yeah, businesses are a really key voice in making that case, I think.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. In Brazil, legislation prioritizes waste picker cooperatives, but does not support informal waste pickers. Furthermore, the national policy focuses on shared responsibility, not on EPR. Do you believe that converting to EPR is necessary to reach a circular economy?
So on the first part of that, maybe we can reverse the order on this. I'll go first and just can comment. So on the first part of that, yes, so Brazil is an excellent example of how to work with waste picker cooperatives, help waste pickers move up the value chain and how to contract with them. It's not such a good example of how to work with individual waste pickers, and that's where the example from South Africa, for example, is really good. So that is something that Brazil could move forward on. Obviously, Brazil set up shared responsibility before before there was very much momentum around EPR globally, so it's a different system. But my understanding is that they are moving towards a more EPR-like system on a product-by-product basis at the moment.
Maybe I'll follow on there by referring back to the points that I made in our living income study, where we studied the actual incomes of waste pickers in many locations around the world. And in Brazil, in our study, for example, in Sao Paulo, the formally organized waste picker earnings were the highest in the world. No, actually, the second highest in the world. Correct that. But the independent waste picker earnings were among the lowest in the world. So I think that just calls out the gap between the formally organized and the informally organized. It's great if you are formally organized, but if you are on the margins of that, you know, the living conditions are very, very challenging indeed.
Thanks. And oh yeah, Dorothy, go ahead.
I have to unmute myself. What would you recommend governments who are setting up an EPR law? And always we hear that they have the informal sector in mind. They know that it exists and they want to integrate it. But how do you reach out to an informal sector? What do you recommend governments there in order to, maybe to get the organized waste pickers and also the not organized waste pickers, because they're also part of the system?
Yes, it can be difficult. I think, so I talked about the need for that participatory process as step 2 of integrating waste pickers into EPR. Now that is a bit easier to do where you have national associations of waste pickers. So in South Africa, you've got 2, Arrow and Sorpa, that were part of that process. Obviously in Brazil, you've got the association there and ANCAT, their technical arm. So approaching the national associations of waste pickers is definitely the first step. We work very closely with the International Alliance of Waste Pickers, and they have national organizations that are members in, I think it's around 40 countries globally. Even where a national organization doesn't exist, there often are, you know, regional or local groups that exist. And there are processes, there are ways of contacting them. So one of the FCI members, Tearfund, has set out a process for engaging with informal waste pickers. And I think that has been published publicly now, so we could certainly share that with you after the webinar. Yeah.
Thank you. I will shortly share in the chat, just in response to the question about the data on values for individual waste pickers and cooperatives, whether those are publicly available. Yes, all of them are available on the Fair Circularity Initiative website, where we published the detailed case studies of all the different research areas that we undertook. And I'll share that address in the chat in a moment. I just want to go back to the previous question about what are some of the first steps that that governments can take. And I want to emphasize the importance of the definition of waste picker, which is why we shared that at the beginning of the presentation. And the reason that's so important is that until you define who a waste picker is, they can get lumped into other categories of worker and not be visible from a legislative point of view. So, for example, in some of the countries that we're working with, it's difficult to actually define a waste picker in ways that the government can recognize, because there is no embedded definition of what a waste picker is. And that's why it's really important to refer to the definition which was set out by the International Alliance of Waste Pickers, that helps define what waste pickers are and are not.
Yeah, and the key challenge there, so in Indonesia, for example, the context we've been looking at recently, waste pickers is not a recognised profession, not a recognised occupation in their national statistics. So there's a kind of invisibility around waste picking. Whereas in Brazil, one of the things that happened a couple of decades ago was to introduce waste picking as an occupation in their national statistics, and that helped give a lot of visibility to the profession.
Yeah, I would just add that maybe, you know, this is more long term, but making sure that they're also heard in any kind of hearing or processes or governance structure, especially when it comes to the PRO setup. That's going to be extremely important in ensuring that they actually have a voice at the table as well.
Yeah, and I think that's probably key to the answer to Alpha's question in the chat about whether we recommend bottom-up or top-down approaches to integrating waste pickers. I mean, I think it's probably both, but the key thing is that participatory approach that develops a contextually appropriate way of doing waste picker integration in a particular country. So if you can bring together waste picker leaders and representatives with academics, with the relevant data, with businesses, then it's possible to design an approach that works. And that might involve some top-down elements, like what we were just talking about, recognizing waste picking as an occupation in national statistics. And it will also incorporate some bottom-up elements, like support for waste pickers to organize themselves or to be registered. So it's both of those, I think, are required. And the key is putting the effort into defining a contextually appropriate approach and giving waste pickers a key role in that.
I have a question. I thought that the living income study was very interesting, and I was wondering if you've seen any successful examples where they've included this livable wage or minimum wage within the informal sector integration in the EPR system, or once they've formalized, did they include that element of having a fair minimum wage? Have you seen examples of that?
I would say it's early days. Some countries are, you know, more advanced than others. So let's see. In some cases, I'm just looking at the collection of the results. I think in one case it was very interesting. That the minimum wage was actually higher than the living income, and that's only in one country, and that was in Java. So I think, you know, where you can see a minimum wage that's set closer to the living income, then that can certainly help. But in most cases, the results are still very, very far behind. And I think just going back to the example of Brazil, it's done wonders for those waste pickers that are organized in cooperatives. And the same is true of a study that we did in Cuiabá, also in Brazil. Really healthy incomes, very close to the living wage for formally organized workers. But, you know, again, really nothing for the independent workers, and there are a lot of them.
Yeah, and I think that's the two-pronged approach. So that the contracting with waste picker cooperatives for those who are organised is really important. That's what the living income study showed. And I think for those who are operating individually, that collection service fee approach that they have in South Africa, and is also in Ghana's draft legislation, is also something that has been tried off and on in Bogota. I think that is probably the most promising approach for waste pickers operating on an individual basis.
Thank you. And last question in the chat. Oh, never mind. There's one after too. But one from Brenda. Can you help identify funding sources to implement the improvement of living conditions of waste pickers? Is this something the study covers?
Funding sources. Well, I guess that's where we make the link back to EPR. I mean, the funding comes from in most cases from the waste pickers' collections, and that is their source of revenue. And that's why it's so important that they have access to other benefits, other forms of insurance, other forms of social protections that help to bridge that gap.
And I think that's something that you covered in the CGF study, Delia, isn't it, about setting fees appropriately?
Yeah, there is a question of obviously fair and consistent payment mechanism, but also making sure that the EPR funds are used effectively to close some of the gaps, and also that they actually reach waste pickers as well. It is a question of governance and of making sure that the fees are actually properly used as well.
And then on that last question, Heidri, nice to hear from you. Yes, there are examples of that. So probably the most well known is in Pune in India, where waste picker groups collect door to door. They do household waste collection, and that's been very successful. They contract with the local government there. There are other examples of that in other places, and it's quite common for often in areas of informal housing, for example, that there are informal waste picker groups doing door-to-door waste collection. So that would be recyclables plus organic waste potentially. And the opportunity there is to integrate them into a wider waste management system rather than to try and replace it, as we saw in the Egypt example. So that's not the case in every country or city, but it is relatively common. And there is an opportunity there for wider integration beyond EPR.
Thought maybe Delia is trying to speak. Delia, are you there?
Oh, no. I was just trying to read through the chat to see if there's anything else that came
Okay.
up. Sorry.
No problem. I think that's all of the questions in the chat. Please feel free to raise your hand or write in the chat if you have any other questions. This is the last minute, so get them in quickly if there's anything else.
We did get some great questions, so thank you for the audience to actually, listening in and being super interactive with us.
Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah, if not, then we will close today's session. Thank you so much, Rich, Charlene, and Delia, for presenting today, for sharing your findings on the living wage report, but also the report done in tandem with CGF. Like Charlene said, these reports and case studies have been published, and so we'll make sure to share them in the follow-up email that we have with you. So thank you so much once again for presenting and having you here today.
Thank you.
Thank you
for the
very much.
invitation.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.
Have a lovely
Thank
day
you.
or evening. Bye.
Good evening.